All right, so the first thing that we're going to take a look at here is adding styling to our application because right now our application works perfectly fine, right? We can edit notes, we can add notes, we can delete notes, etc. But it looks pretty boring, right? And in some places it just looks downright bad, I'm not going to lie. Like when you're editing notes, that's got to change. So, what we're going to do first is go through and add some styles to our entire application. Now, as we've seen, there's a lot of different ways you can actually go about adding styles to a React application, anywhere from using something called styled components to using CSS modules to just using regular CSS inside the index.css file. Now, in order to make this as easy and painless as possible, what we're going to do is just write all of our styles inside the index.css file. To be honest, this is generally how I start off my styling, and as the application gets more complex, that's when I'll actually start moving toward the more specialized things like CSS modules or styled components, where I can kind of have my overarching styles, the ones that apply to a lot of different components inside index.css, and have everything else, right, the much more specific things inside the individual CSS files for those components. So just as a side note here, the modal body and modal background, those are probably the kind of things that I would want to put inside some kind of CSS file that's specific to the modal component. Or you could also have that in styled components and just write these as their own styled components inside the modal.js file we have. Okay, and the same thing for modal top bar and modal close button as well. These could probably all go inside a CSS file specific to the modal component itself. And in fact, I'll probably end up doing that, but for now, just to get our app looking as good as possible, as quickly as possible, let's just write all of the styles for our application inside this index.css file. Okay, and then we can kind of split them up afterward if we want to. Personally, the first thing I like to do when adding styling to a React application is change the font. And as we've done in the past, I'm going to use the Google Roboto font. All right, and you can find that right here if you go to fonts.google.com and just search for Roboto. And what we're going to do, we're going to pick the Light 300 version. We're going to click on select this style. And I'm not sure if you've seen this before, but basically what this will do is generate a series of links that will take care of importing that font into our application when it's running in the user's browser. And then we're going to use the bold 700. That's just a good, it's a good amount of bold for our application here. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to copy this link that it's generated for us. Notice here that it's included the 300 and 700 weights. We could include extra ones if we knew we were going to need those weights as well. But in general, it's a good idea to only include the weights that you need because this just helps your application to load faster. So I'm going to copy these link tags and we're going to put them inside the index.css file of our application, or index.html file rather, and that's going to be inside our public and index.html. And we're just going to add these things up here at the top. I'm just going to put it right underneath here, right underneath the last meta tag. And that should take care of importing those fonts for us. So now that we've made those fonts available in our application, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to set that as the default font for our entire app. And to do that, we just have to go into index.css. We're going to add that style to our body here. So we're just going to say font family. We're going to set that to Roboto. And we're going to set sans serif as the backup just in case that font fails to load for some reason. All right, and to make sure that our buttons and inputs also have this font family, because by default they won't follow that, which is a little annoying if you take a look at that there. That doesn't look like the same style to me. So what we're going to do is go back here, and we're going to just add, for now, a basic button style, which will say font family, Roboto sans serif. We can just copy that if we want to. And here, let me adjust the indentation for these so that it matches the rest of the file. And we're going to do the same thing for inputs and text areas. So we'll say input, text area. And for this, we're just going to paste that same thing. Oops, there we go. And that should make it so that the text inside those elements is the same as the rest of our application. So if we go back here now, we'll see that that's updated the font inside the button. And if we click on edit, we'll see that the text inside our input and inside our text area looks the same way as well. All right, so in addition, these buttons still look kind of bad, as buttons in unstyled sites tend to look. So let's just add a few more styles to our buttons. First of all, we're just going to make the background color of all the buttons in our application black. If you have a preferred brand color, something like that, you can, you can use that instead. But I'm just going to do black here. We're going to make the border none to get rid of that ugly gray border around the buttons. We're going to say border radius. We're going to give them a nice round edge, just like I do with pretty much all elements in my applications. We're going to set the text color here to white so that we get some nice contrast with that black background color. Let's see, we already set the font family, so we can just leave that. We're going to set a cursor to pointer so that we get that little pointer thing when we hover over one of these buttons, which looks good. And let's see, just a few more things that we want to do. We want to set the font size to the same size as the rest of the application, which is 16 pixels. We're going to set the outline to none, and we're going to set the padding to 16 pixels. Now, some of these styles we're going to want to include in our input and text area styling as well, so we can actually just create a common area for those things. Or you can just duplicate them if you want. It doesn't really matter too much at this point. Okay, so for our input and text area, we're going to want the border radius to be the same, so I'll take that out and put that in here. We're going to want the font family to also be Roboto Sans Serif. We already put that in there, but I'll just put that in the shared styles up here. We're going to want the font size to be the same. We're going to want to have outline none, and we're also going to want the padding to be the same for those. So we'll put that all up in here. And we're also going to want box sizing to be border box for all of those so that they fit correctly when we try and do something like width 100%. Okay, so that leaves just a few extra styles inside our button. So let's add some more to our input and text area. First of all, we're going to want to set a different border for those. We're going to say border 2 pixels solid. And then we'll just do a nice light gray border there. And actually, that should be all we need to do. I was just looking at my notes here, and I think that's the only one that isn't shared between them. So let's go over and take a look and see what that looks like. I'm just going to close this window here so I stop having to scroll through it. And sure enough, we see that our buttons are looking pretty good. Our inputs are looking pretty good. There's some funny stuff going on with the alignment here, but we'll take care of that in a little while. And everything is looking overall just a little bit better. So another thing that I like to do with my buttons is I like to have the text inside of them bold. So what you can do for that, if you want to do that, is set the font weight to bold. And that just gives it a little more oomph, if I do say so myself. If you don't like it, don't do it. So anyway, now that we've added those global styles for those things, we are going to obviously have to add a little bit of spacing in between our buttons and stuff here, but we'll worry about that in a little while. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to set up some extra styles for each of our pages so that this stuff isn't all the way over here to the left-hand side. This is something that we've done previously as well, but doesn't hurt to review. And again, this is something that I generally do at this point. Anyway, so what we're going to do is we're going to create a style, and we're basically going to wrap all of our pages in it here, as you'll see, that will basically constrain the width of the page to a certain amount and put it in the center of the screen. All right, so what we're going to do here, the way that we're going to add that to all of our pages without having to go in and add it to each specific page, we're going to open up our routes component here. And what we're going to do is surround whatever route is being displayed with a div that has some CSS styling that will constrain its width to a certain amount and take care of centering it. Okay, so what we're going to do is inside this router component, we're going to say div. We're going to give it class name equal to content container. And we're going to basically have all of this stuff, including the switch, be inside of that. And for the styling for that, we're going to again open up index.css. And we're going to add a class here, which we'll call content container. Okay, content container. And the styles for this, we're going to say max width. We'll set that to something like 700 pixels. And we'll set margin to auto, which will make it automatically centered horizontally. So there we go. So what that's going to look like, we should see that our stuff is now moved over. It's still looking a little funny because we haven't actually adjusted the width and that kind of stuff to make it take up the full width that's available to it. That's something we'll do shortly, but for now it's at least not all the way over to the left-hand side of the page. So the next thing that we're going to do, as I said, is we want to make it so that certain elements in our application, such as when we edit these things and we have these inputs and text areas and buttons, we want to make it so that we can have an element displayed across 100% of the available width without having to actually add that width 100% directly to each and every element via style. So the way that we're going to do this, the way that I usually like to do it, and this is inspired by the way that libraries like Material UI usually do it, I'm just going to create a CSS class called full width, and inside there we're going to set width to 100%. So now all we have to do is add this style to elements that we want to be full width, and it will automatically take care of that for us. And while we're at it, I guess, let's add some other classes. We're going to add another class which is called space below, which will add a margin below whatever element we add it to. Okay, so we'll say margin bottom, and we'll just set that to something like 8 pixels. And that should be good for now. So let's go and add these full width and space below classes to wherever they're needed. So what we're going to do, we'll start off with full width. Basically, this is going to be applied in several different places in our application. The first one's going to be in the new note form. All right, so if we go in here, we're going to click cancel, we're going to go back, and if we click on add a new note, notice that this stuff is all kind of scrunched over here on the left-hand side. So what we're going to do to actually make it look like a real form is we're just going to make the input and button 100% of the width of their container. And we're also going to adjust the width of this container here as well because it's a little too wide. Okay, so all we need to do for that is on this input, we're going to add class name equals full width, and we're also going to add the space below class that we added before to make sure there's a little space between that and our button. And for our button itself, we're going to say class name equals full width. We don't have to have space below here because there's nothing below it. All right, so that's going to change the way it looks a little bit. I'm thinking that's looking a little better already, so let's adjust the width of this container here before we move on. And all we're going to do that is just adjust the width of the modal body. So we're just going to open up index.css again. I should probably stop closing this file because we're going to need it, but we're just going to adjust modal body, and we're going to add, instead of max width 50%, which we did just for the heck of it, we're going to say max width 400 pixels, and that should make it a much more reasonable size there, I think. So that's looking pretty good. So we can create a new note now at our leisure. We'll say something like hello there. And if we click create, we'll see that that will appear. All right, so where else do we need the full width styling? We already added it to the new note form. The next thing we're going to add it to is the note detail page. As I mentioned, that's probably one of the ones that's most in need of it. If we view one of these things, actually let's view one with some text here. We're going to want, when we're editing this, for these things to all be on their own line and not all jumbled like they are right now. So let's open that page up. We're going to open up our note detail page, and I'm just going to close the new note form because we don't need that right now. And what we're going to do is down here to each of the inputs and text areas and buttons, we're going to say class name equals full width and space below. We're going to do that same thing for our text area, same thing for our button. I'm just copying and pasting it here. Oh, and be careful with the button. I almost just pasted that inside the on-click handler there. And for this button here as well, we'll do the same thing. There we go. And return that, return that. There we go. Okay. Oh, and we don't need space below on this last one. Not that it really matters, but why add extra stuff? Okay, so we're going to go over here now, and everything is looking a little better than it was before, at least. We are going to add a nav bar later on too as well, so that this thing won't be right up at the top of the screen like it is, so don't worry about that for now. And then the last place we're going to need to add that full width style, oops, let me try that again. And then the last place we're going to add that full width style is going to be in the notes page, and we're going to add it to the create note button. So that's going to be down here. What we're going to do is say class name equals full width. All right, let me just adjust the indentation here, and that will now look like that, right? So it'll be along the bottom of our page, nice and big so that we can see it if we need to add a new note. And again, we will add some more spacing between here. Just bear with me because we're actually going to rewrite some of the styles for each of these items here to make it look pretty different than it's looking right now. All right, so the next piece that we're going to add styling to is going to be the delete modal, right? The way that we're currently displaying the buttons is a little funny looking. What we want to have happen is we want basically these two buttons together to take up the entirety of the width available to them and split it between them so that, you know, it will actually be apparent that it's two separate buttons and not just one button scrunched together. So what that's going to look like, since this is actually a pretty common thing that we'll want to do in our application going forward, we're going to create a more generic style inside our index.css file, similar to what we did with full width and space below. But what we're going to do is create a class called .evenlyspaced, and this is just going to have a single style called displayFlex, and underneath that we're going to say evenly spaced, and basically everything that's a direct child of evenly spaced, which is what this means here, we're going to say flex 1, and just for purposes of putting some space between them, we'll say margin 0 and 4 pixels, which should put some nice spacing horizontally between them. All right, so let's open up our confirm delete note form component now, and what we're going to do is wrap these two buttons in a div with that class that we just created. So we'll say class name evenly spaced, and we'll put these two buttons inside of that div. All right, so if we go back over now, we should see that those two buttons are displayed quite nicely across the bottom of our delete note modal. And we can actually do the same thing for our items here in our list if we do that with our delete and view buttons. Now we are actually going to be rewriting those, but what the heck, we created this nice class, so we might as well for now. And what we're going to do here, we're just going to say notes list. We're going to open that up, and we're going to wrap both of our delete and view buttons inside a div with that class name, same one as before. We're going to say evenly spaced, and we'll put those two buttons inside of there like that. Okay, so if we go back now, ooh, it looks like those aren't quite the way we wanted them. We'll need to actually add full width to this view button since it's inside this link, right? What's happening is that the link component itself is quietly taking up this full width, and the view button is just happy being its normal width because buttons by default won't take up that full width of their container. So all we need to do for our button here is just say class name equals full width, and that should take care of that. So again, there's no space here. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but I guess if you wanted to, you could say something like style, just add an inline style here and say something like margin, or you know what, let's do padding bottom, and we could do something like 8 pixels. And that would basically add that space that we're looking for to make it look a little bit better. So that's almost it for the basic styling for our application. We are going to get into a few more, a few trickier pieces of styling shortly, but for now, let's just look through and see if there's anything else. One thing that I wanted to add to our application actually is if a note doesn't currently have any content, like our new note that we created here, I want to add a backup message that'll probably be all in italics that will say something like this note currently has no content, something like that, right? So in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to open up our note detail page, which I just closed here. Let me open that up again. And what we're going to do is up here, or down here rather, where we're displaying our note content, we're first going to test and see if that content even exists. So we'll say note.content. We're going to use a ternary operator. If that content exists, we'll just display it in a paragraph tag. Otherwise, we're going to display that message I talked about earlier that will say something like, this note currently has no content. Okay, and if we go back here, we'll see that right there. But what I want to do is display this in a slightly weaker kind of font, right? We'll make it in italics or something to show that this isn't the actual content of the note, which is kind of what it looks like right now. So let's go back here. We're going to add a special class for this purpose. So let's open up index.css again, and we're going to add a class called, I don't know, we'll call it something like, we can call it italic, or we can call it weak, something like that. Probably weak is better because if we name it italic and we want to stop displaying it as italic and start displaying it as kind of grayed out or something like that, we would have to actually change the name of that style to make that make sense. So we'll just choose something like weak, and inside here we'll just say font style italic, and we'll add that class to this one. We'll say class name equals weak, and there we go. It's displaying a little bit more obviously that there's no actual content in the note. All right, and actually now that I think about it, our cancel and save changes buttons would be good candidates for the evenly spaced thing instead of full width. So while we're at it, let's just go and make that change as well. Open up note detail page, which is already here, and we're going to wrap these two buttons inside their own div, which will have the class name of evenly spaced. There we go, evenly spaced. And we're going to put those buttons in there, and we can remove the class names from both of those buttons. All right, so that's what that'll look like instead. I think that looks a little bit better. It's a little more readable, so there you go. And that should be about all of the styling that we're going to add to our components for now. Again, feel free to spice this up a little bit with more colors and stuff like that. But anyway, at least we're not working with the default HTML styles for now. I usually like to get rid of those things at this point because I start wanting to actually have results that look halfway decent. So that's why we did this right now. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.